So I made this script over a year ago. So take into account when I make statements about what the text generation software I was using can and can't do. That may have changed since then. Not sure about that because I haven't been experimenting as much with text generation. Just take that into account. If it looks like a poem and sounds like a poem, is it a poem? Does a work require artistic intent to be considered art? Can a computer write a poem? Lately, I've been experimenting with text generation websites like the Intricate demo and TextSynth, and the result has been some strange things, some really funny things, some beautiful things. But what I've found is that to get a good, coherent, beautiful set of lines, it requires a lot of tweaking the inputs and curation. It's not as common to get a fully coherent poem right off the bat. Computers don't have intent as far as we are aware. So can something be a poem without intent? A pre-computer example of this I can think of would be there was a practice in Dada circles where they would take a newspaper and cut it up so that you have basically a bunch of like random words. Put those words in a bag, pull out those words one at a time in a completely random order. So then you basically have just a random string of words. But then you have the issue where it's like there's still intent behind it in the sense that the Dadaist intended the string of words, the poem, to be random. So it is still poetry with intent behind it. In the same way, if programmers make an algorithm that writes poetry, the resulting poetry has the intent not of the computer, but of the programmer. The computer is not independent of the programmer, but really could it ever be, because if there was a computer that was successfully independent, that was built to be independent, that would be within the will of the programmer, because it was the programmer's will for the program to be independent. So that's a bit of a rabbit trail, because I do think that even without intent, my inclination is to think something can still be a poem, because poetry is something crafted out of word and sound and imagination. It's not a spontaneous effuse of a soul, but it's something built. So even if the AI is not a poet, the result can be poetry. But from curiosity about the role of curation in creating AI-generated poetry, about how audiences interpreted that, I decided to do a very non-scientific study about AI-generated poetry. So in the study, I surveyed 21 people on some poems. The first half was the portion of curated poems. So there were 5 AI-generated poems and 5 human-generated poems that I had gathered. They were of mixed quality, obviously quality from my opinion, so subjective, but 3 of the human-generated poems were by professional poets, 2 were by amateur poets, and the AI-generated poems, while it was a mixture of ones I thought were obviously AI-generated versus ones I thought were less obvious, they were ones that I thought were at least interesting. They were ones I'd curated. They were not just, random first generations. And I asked people how much they liked them. I asked people to describe them, so whether they thought they were, interesting versus confusing versus beautiful, etc. And just for fun, I also asked people what I thought they meant, just because I thought that'd be fun. And then, of course, whether people thought they were human or AI generated. The second half was the uncurated portion. For this half, in preparation, I created some prompts, and I gave these same prompts to some human poets, mostly my siblings, and then I also put these prompts into text generators, and the result, of course, was a bunch of first generations, first drafts from the human poets, and first generations completely uncurated, except for a few exceptions, which we'll get into when I talk about that half. And then I had people try to guess which were human written and which were AI written. So, for the first half, I removed the titles because TextSynth and Intricate rarely create titles, and I didn't want titlelessness to be a dead giveaway. The main things I measured were, I measured something I called a humanness score, which is how often people said a poem was human-generated, regardless of whether it was actually human-generated or not. 8 out of 10 of these poems still have over half of respondents thinking they're human-written, so humanness skews high. And I also scored them based on how well-liked or likable they were, basically their star rating, the average star rating, average opinion of these people that I surveyed. An interesting thing I noticed overall, likability and humanness tend to mirror each other. Not entirely, but they tend to. So the perception of the audience is that humans write better or more likable poetry, whether or not that's actually true. And actually both the highest and lowest ranked poems in likability were human-written, and the second highest and second lowest ranked poems were AI-written, so make of that what you will. But how people described poems and their interpretations were interesting too, especially for AI-generated poems. In my view of art, audience interpretation does not determine meaning, in my opinion, but I also don't think authorial intent alone determines meaning. And of course, in the case of AI-generated poems, it's very questionable whether the authors have intent. So audience interpretation is a really interesting clue to, if there is meaning at all in AI-generated poetry. So for the human poems in this section, I picked The Bright Field by R.S. Thomas because I thought this was a good example of free verse poetry. I picked Oil and Blood by W.B. Yeats because I thought it was, by a good poet, but, not his very best. And then because I wanted at least 2 poems that would not be recognizable, I picked a poem by myself and a poem by my sister, and then I also picked But If a Living Dance Upon Dead Minds by E. Cummings, which is a very experimental poem, and I picked that partly because experimentation is what AI is less able to do, but also because I knew it might be mistaken for AI. I wanted to see if it would happen. It did happen. Discounting the guesses of people who recognized the poem, who recognized it as a E. Cummings poem, 80% of people thought that it was written by AI. E. Cummings is a robot, apparently. And also almost half of people thought that Fair Weather, which was the poem written by my sister, was written by a robot. And literally so many things in these results were causing me to doubt the validity of this entire survey, like how people liked my not very good poem better than the R.S. Thomas poem. So I'm not going to go in as much detail about what people said about the human-generated poems, since those were obviously the controls. I want to go more into what people said about the AI-generated poetry, because that's what the survey's about. So let's go into that. So of the AI-generated poems I picked, the highest in perceived humanness was this poem, with 86% of respondents thinking it was written by a human. Like insects, we are tiny specks, wondering what's beyond our horizon, dreading the darkness and yearning for light. The universe is infinite and all-encompassing, with humans not the beginning, the end, or even the midpoint. We are somewhere in between. I picked it for the survey because it is coherent, it could be mistaken for human writing, and it's a clear result of curation as I trimmed it out of the middle of a longer piece of generated poetry, which was not very coherent. And the most common description people gave of this was meaningful. 12 people called it meaningful. And the average ranking is 3.2 stars. And it was the overall second favorite, coming after a actually human-generated poem. Looking at some of the ways that people interpreted this, completely intentless, or as far as we know, completely intentless poem. Someone said the fickleness of human life. Another person said that in the grand scale of things, human beings may be small, but not insignificant. It is our sense of wonder that raises us above our apparent position in the scale of things. Someone said it seems to be about existential dread, and most respondents said something like that. It's interesting because, I do think in this case, the meaning is clear. It's very, honestly, almost too straightforward. I don't like it very much because of that. It doesn't have a lot of imagery. It's just kind of saying, saying things. And so because of that, though, like, it has, like, it's interesting, like, a AI generated poem has clear meaning, even though there's not intent behind it. The next one in perceived humanness was a poem that actually did have a title, but I had to cut it off, called The Doctor in the Abyss. I removed the title for the survey, obviously, because I was removing titles in general, but also because the title was part of a text prompt I put in, so it doesn't really count as the bot titling the poem. But it had a clearer structure, and had actual imagery, which is why I picked it. I went down to the seas again, the barren places of the sea, crowded with people doing cruel deeds, living careless lives. Terrified of the people, I searched for help, and looked in the eyes of the living and the dead, till I fathomed the secrets of the ocean of life, and I understood that the sea is but a mirror of the heart. I am a shadow of the ocean in the eyes of the living. I am the shadow of the ocean in the eyes of the dead. I am the shadow of the ocean in the ocean itself, and there my reflection is endless. The most common descriptor people gave of this was sad or melancholy. Overall score of 3 stars, 4th place in both humanness and fondness. So that's kind of the mirroring I was talking about, where a lot of times, like, they have the same rank. Some of the interpretations people gave of this was, the speaker feels like the ocean is a better reflection of themselves than other people are. Someone said drowning, death, watery graves. Another person said bravery in reaction to surroundings. Another person said, I'm not sure about this one, lol. Understandable. The interpretations are mixed. The poem's more obscure. Knowing that it's AI, the instinct is just pass it off as nonsense without meaning, images and phrases put together in a way that sounds decent, okay, but doesn't mean anything. But interestingly, when the audience thinks that it's human-made, they search the phrases and do try to string it into something meaningful. Good interpretation, though, what's difficult is, I don't think good interpretation is just making your own meaning out of something. I think it's figuring out what a work actually means, not just what it means to you. But in this case, who can say what it actually means? The curator, the interpreter? Where is the human element, and does it even need a human element to have meaning? Can it mean without having intent? There's a quote from C.S. Lewis, speaking on literary criticism in an unfinished essay. He says, "It's the author who intends the book means. We often look to intent to give us the clearest possible idea of meaning, but without intent and without even agreement on interpretation, as in the case of this poem, we have no such clues." The 2 poems next in perceived humanness were Liliana and this poem, which I'll read in a moment, with 76% of respondents thinking both of these were written by humans. Liliana was interesting because it was a poem titled by the generator, and I wasn't surprised that a lot of people thought it was human-written because it did have a lot of coherency to it. I'll show it on the screen, but I'm not going to read it because I don't want to have to read all of these. Over half of respondents called it meaningful, which is interesting, since the other poem where meaningful was the top describer was also an AI-generated poem. And yeah, so I wasn't surprised that a lot of people thought it was human-written. But in the case of this other poem that I'm about to read, it surprised me that so many thought it was human-written. I'll read it now. Cease, amber boy, your throat which is a golden string, sing on. Your voice is now as soft as storied horn, or readiest pen of goldsmith's art. Pour upon me the fullness of your heart. Let the music go out of you and make richness and terribleness abundant as me, that I, in you, and you, in me, may laugh. I thought it was more clearly AI-generated, but it still sounded like good, or at least funny, which is why I put it in. And also, well, like the first line especially, to me, sounded like a Tumblr text post or something. It was really funny to me. But a lot of people still thought it was human-written. The one person said, clearly written by a robot, but I like it, which is what I thought. But other interpretations were different. Someone said, the speaker is asking the artist to sing and release their emotions. And another person said, the first person narrator is encouraging a singer to keep singing. Maybe it is a medieval bard telling tales at an inn. Another person just said, life is cool. So, as for the least human poem of the bunch, not counting E. Cummings, of course, who, as we mentioned, is a confirmed robot, was this poem. Songs without names, like rain on desert sands. All that the soul asks, it receives. This was a very small set of lines taken out, which I thought made a good micropoem. Others disagreed. Average star rating was 2, and compared to the other AI poems, humanness was low. Only 38% thought it was written by a human. So as I mentioned, for the second part of the study, I created some prompts, and I gave these prompts to human poets and told them to write a rough draft without going back to edit. And I also inputted the same prompts into GPT via the text synth playground GPT-J6b temperature 1. Each prompt had a different mix of human and AI, so that there wouldn't be people wouldn't figure out like, oh, there's 3 of these are human, 3 of these are AI. So the only curating done was, this was supposed to be the uncurated section. I will say there was a small amount of curating. I would cut it off if it went into non-poem text. So like if the text generator was writing poetry and then it went like into prose, I would cut it off there. Because actually it's pretty common for the text generators to do that, where they'll start writing a poem and then they'll stop, and because they're copying text on the internet, they'll stop and they'll say something like, this poem first appeared in the Atlantic, or they'll stop and they say, the poem by blah 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 represents what, like they're imitating different articles they've seen online. So I did that, and a few times I did retry the generator. I only had to do this 4 times. If something was clearly not a poem, so like if I was telling it to generate a poem, but it was starting to generate like something that wasn't a poem, or like if it was starting to generate an analysis or something instead, or if it got stuck in a loop, which is a thing that can happen. I didn't do any editing other than in InfraKit, it will generate everything with a blank line between it, and you have to delete those. I used 5 prompts with 4 poems to each prompt, and each with a different mix of human and AI. The idea was to compare unedited, uncurated, AI-generated poetry and unedited, uncurated, human-generated poetry. So some of my predictions for this portion is that I would guess that the AI-generated poems would be more obviously AI-generated, and so the number of poems that would have over half of respondents calling it human-generated would be lower, and people would have significant more ease detecting AI-generated poems. Surprisingly, of the 10 AI-generated poems from this section, only 1 had less than half of respondents think it was human-written, so still, even with the lack of curation, still most people seem to think that these were human-written. None of the human-made poems had over half thinking they were AI-generated, which is probably explained by the fact that I wasn't there to choose poems which I knew could be mistaken for AI. Overall, the average number of respondents who thought an AI-generated poem was human-written in the curated section was 71.4%, while the average for the non-curated section was 69.1%. So the curated poems were more human-seeming, but not by as much as I would have guessed. Does this mean that human curation efforts don't have nearly as much to do with the human element of AI poems as I previously thought? Or does it just mean that people who haven't spent hours sifting through AI poetry have less of a nose for the difference between AI-generated and human-generated poems? Overall, this very unscientific study suggests that human curation has some effect on the perceived humanness of poems, but not as much effect as I would expect. It also suggests that in general, people have lower expectations for what AI is capable of than what AI is actually capable of. Since most of the AI-generated poems were mistaken for human poems, audience perception and interpretation does not distinguish between AI and human as much as I would expect, even in non-curated poetry. Finally, the perception of meaning in poems that lack intent introduces an interesting question. Is the audience seeing meaning that is not there, or can meaning exist without intent, lying in the work itself, rather than the author alone?